In polite society, love is rarely spoken of. Worth is measured instead by where one is seated, by who is presented, by who is allowed to be seen. Some are raised to shine beneath chandeliers. Others are taught, quietly and carefully, to remain upstairs, out of sight. This is a story about the latter. I was not hidden because I lacked beauty, nor because I lacked breeding. I was hidden because my stepmother understood something society rarely admits, that once a woman is seen, she can no longer be controlled. On the night of the debutante ball, my sisters descended the stairs in silk and confidence, while I was instructed to remain behind. The music rose. The candles were lit. The world assembled to judge worth. And I sat alone, listening from a room I was never meant to leave, certain that no one would notice my absence. But I was wrong. Because across the crowded ballroom, one man had begun to wonder not who dazzled him, but who was missing. And when the Earl asked that question, everything my stepmother had so carefully arranged began to unravel. Before we go further, hit subscribe. It helps keep me visible on the map and out of the shadows. One learns early which doors remain open, and which close quietly the moment one approaches. The house on Grosvenor Square had belonged to Eliza's father. This fact, though legally indisputable, had become socially irrelevant by the time she turned 12. When Thomas Harcourt died, suddenly, and with the sort of financial improvidence that embarrasses even one's solicitors, he left behind three things of note: a modest estate entangled in debt, a daughter who read too much, and a widow who understood precisely how precarious her position had become. Lady Beatrice Harcourt was not cruel in the fashion of novels. She did not lock Eliza in attics or deny her meals. She did not raise her voice, nor her hand. In fact, to an outside observer, and society is composed entirely of outside observers, Lady Beatrice appeared to fulfill her duties with admirable grace. Eliza was clothed, educated, after a fashion, permitted to take her meals with the family when no guests were present. What she was not permitted was space. Not the physical kind, though her bedroom had been quietly reassigned to the smaller chamber overlooking the mews when Beatrice's own daughters arrived from her first marriage. No, the space Eliza lost was more fundamental. The space to be remembered. The space to be considered. The space to expect that when plans were made, she might be included in them. It happened gradually, as all erosions do. At first, there were explanations. Eliza, darling, I've enrolled the girls at Madame Du Bois's Academy for Deportment. You understand, they're at such a delicate age. Perhaps next season, when you're older. She had been 13. Her stepsisters, Caroline and Dorothea, were 12 and 14. The modiste is coming Thursday, but truly, there's no need for you to sit through all those fittings. You know how tedious they are. I'll have her bring up something suitable afterward. Something suitable arrived 3 weeks later, a dress in last season's cut, altered from one of Caroline's cast-offs. Lord and Lady Pembroke have invited us to the country for the shooting party, but their estate is rather small, and with the girls coming out soon, it's important they make the right impressions. You don't mind terribly, do you? You've always preferred your books to country society anyway. Eliza had never been to a country house party. She had no notion whether she preferred books to something she had never been permitted to experience. But she learned, with each careful exclusion, that minding terribly was not something one did aloud. By the time she was 16, the pattern had calcified into routine. Her stepmother's voice had a particular quality, soft, solicitous, edged with the kind of concern that made refusal seem churlish. She never commanded. She suggested. She worried. She protected. And Eliza, who had spent 4 years learning that obedience was the price of tentative belonging, had begun to believe the story being constructed around her. That she was fragile. That she was unsuited to scrutiny. That the world beyond the morning room was sharper than she could bear. You mustn't take it personally, darling. Society can be so unkind to those who aren't quite prepared. Prepared for what, precisely, was never specified. But the implication settled into Eliza's bones, that she lacked something essential, some quality her stepsisters possessed naturally. Caroline's ease with conversation. Dorothea's practiced laugh. Their mother's ability to enter a room and command its attention without appearing to try. Eliza, by contrast, had learned to enter rooms as though apologizing for the space she displaced. She was not, it should be noted, unaware of what was happening. One does not spend years on the periphery of a household without becoming an acute observer of its mechanisms. Eliza understood that she was being made small. She simply believed, in the quiet way one believes unchallenged things, that there must be a reason for it. That perhaps her stepmother saw something in her that required management. Some unsuitability that would be exposed, should she be thrust into society unprepared. It was easier to believe this than to believe the alternative. That she was being erased not for her own protection, but for someone else's convenience. The morning room became her domain by default. It was there she took her breakfast, early, before the others descended. There she read, sewed, wrote letters to aunts who responded with increasing infrequency. The room faced east, and in summer the light was good until mid-morning. In winter, it was the coldest room in the house. She did not complain. Complaint required the belief that one's comfort mattered. Instead, she developed a facility for stillness, for taking up less space, for reading a room's mood before entering it, for sensing when her presence might be tolerated and when it would be inconvenient. She became, in short, invisible. Not because she lacked substance, but because she had been taught, patiently, carefully, and without a single raised voice, that visibility was dangerous. The household revolved around Caroline and Dorothea. Their lessons, their wardrobes, their prospects. Lady Beatrice managed their social debut with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Every introduction was calculated. Every event weighed for its potential to secure advantageous connections. The girls were paraded at appropriate intervals, not too frequently, lest they seem desperate, not too rarely, lest they be forgotten. Eliza watched this machinery operate with a strange, detached fascination. She knew the names of every eligible gentleman in their circle. She understood the nuances of seating arrangements, the hierarchies of invitation lists, the subtle gradations of social precedents that determined who called on whom, and when, and why. She knew all of this because she had been taught it. The same tutors who instructed her stepsisters had, initially, instructed her, and because she had nothing else to do but observe. What she did not know was whether any of it would ever apply to her. On the evening of her 17th birthday, Eliza came downstairs to find the family gathered in the drawing-room. This was unusual. Dinners, when there were no guests, were informal affairs. But tonight, the candles had been lit, and Lady Beatrice wore her pearls. "Eliza," her stepmother said, with that particular smile that always preceded something unpleasant disguised as kindness. "Come sit, darling. We've been discussing your future." Eliza's hands went cold. She Saturday. "You're 17 now," Lady Beatrice continued, "and naturally, we've been considering what's best for you. Your father, God rest him, left provisions for your care, but, well, you understand the limitations." Eliza understood. The estate was entailed. What little money remained had been carefully allocated to Caroline and Dorothea's debut expenses. "We believe," Lady Beatrice said, folding her hands in her lap, "that it would be most prudent to secure you a position. A respectable one, of course. Companion to a gentlewoman, perhaps. Or governess to a family of quality." The words landed with careful softness. Companion. Governess. Positions for women with no prospects. For women who existed in the margins of households, neither servant nor family. For women who had been prepared. "You have such a lovely temperament for it," Lady Beatrice added. "Quiet. Steady. And truly, Eliza, it's far kinder than thrusting you into society when you're not, when it wouldn't be." She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Leaving Eliza to complete it herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts. "When you're not good enough. When it wouldn't be fair to compare you to your sisters. When you have nothing to offer that anyone would want." Eliza heard herself say, "Of course. Whatever you think best." Her voice was steady. She had learned that much, at least. Later, alone in her small room overlooking the mews, Eliza sat by the window and watched the lamplighter make his way down the street. One by one, the lamps flickered to life. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, what had been done to her. Not violently, not cruelly, in any way that could be named or challenged, but thoroughly. She had been taught to disappear. And she had been taught so well that she had nearly forgotten she had ever been visible at all. Some women are raised for ballrooms. Others are raised to remain upstairs, where the music cannot quite reach them. The question, always, is whether they remember they were ever meant to dance at all. There is a particular cruelty in being made intimate with a world one will never be permitted to enter. The invitations began arriving in March. Thick vellum, sealed with wax, delivered by liveried footmen who waited in the hall for responses that were always, invariably, affirmative. Lady Beatrice received them with a performance of studied indifference, as though being invited to every significant event of the season was merely her due, but Eliza noticed how quickly she opened them, how carefully she scanned the guest lists. Caroline and Dorothea were to be presented at court in April. The season proper would begin in May, culminating in the Grosvenor ball in June, the event at which every ambitious mother hoped her daughters would secure either a proposal or a prospect sufficiently promising to justify the extraordinary expense of silk, jewels, and strategic seating arrangements. Lady Beatrice had been planning for this since the girls turned 16. Perhaps, Eliza thought privately, since before they were born. The modiste arrived on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying bolts of fabric in shades that seemed to shimmer even in the muted light of the drawing-room. Eliza had been reading when they entered. She made to leave. Her presence during fittings had long since been discouraged, but Lady Beatrice waved a hand. "Stay, Eliza. I may need you to take notes." So she stayed, and watched as her stepsisters were transformed, piece by piece, into the sort of women society rewarded. Caroline, at 19, had their mother's coloring, fair hair, pale skin, the kind of delicate prettiness that photographed well in miniatures. She stood on the fitting platform with practiced ease, turning when instructed, lifting her arms, tilting her chin. The modiste circled her like a sculptor appraising marble. "The ivory silk," Lady Beatrice declared, "with the pearl beading at the bodice. Nothing ostentatious, we want elegance, not desperation." The modiste nodded approvingly. "Understated refinement. Very wise, my lady." Dorothea was next. At 18, she was darker than her sister, brunette where Caroline was blonde, vivacious where Caroline was serene. She could not stand still during her fitting, kept turning to examine herself from different angles, adjusting the drape of fabric across her shoulders. "The rose silk," Lady Beatrice said. "It complements her complexion." And Dorothea, "Darling, do stand still. A lady does not fidget." "But, Mamma, I want to see." "Dorothea." The single word, spoken softly, was enough. Dorothea stilled. Eliza, seated in the corner with a writing tablet she had not yet used, observed this with the detachment of a natural historian studying a species she would never join. She knew the mechanics of these preparations intimately, had absorbed them through years of proximity, but the knowledge sat in her mind like a language she could read but not speak. She knew that ivory was chosen for Caroline because it suggested purity without the starkness of white. She knew that rose was chosen for Dorothea because it made her appear flushed with health and youth, which was desirable, but not feverish, which was not. She knew that pearls were appropriate but diamonds were not yet, not for an unmarried girl, not unless one wanted to appear grasping. She knew all of this, and none of it had ever been meant for her. What about Eliza? The question came from Caroline, who had turned on the platform and was looking at her stepsister with an expression Eliza could not quite parse. It was not kindness, exactly, nor cruelty, perhaps simply curiosity. The room went very still. Lady Beatrice did not look at Eliza. She adjusted a pin in the fabric at Caroline's waist with minute precision. "Eliza is not being presented this season." "Why not?" This from Dorothea, who had never learned the art of leaving questions unasked. "She's older than I am." "Dorothea." The warning in Lady Beatrice's voice was subtle but unmistakable. "We've discussed this. Eliza has other plans." "What plans?" Eliza felt the weight of the room's attention shift toward her. The modiste's assistants had paused in their work. Even the modiste herself glanced up, though her expression remained professionally neutral. "The sort," Lady Beatrice said, "that suit her temperament. Now, shall we move on to the question of gloves? I believe we'll need at least 3 pairs for each of you." And just like that, Eliza disappeared from the conversation. She had become, over the years, remarkably skilled at this. At being present but not visible. At occupying space without seeming to claim it. At understanding that some questions were not answered because the answers would be too revealing. Caroline turned back to the mirror. Dorothea accepted a swatch of ribbon to examine. And Eliza sat in her corner, taking no notes, thinking about the particular loneliness of watching others prepare for a life she would never be permitted to live. Proximity, it should be noted, is not the same as inclusion. One can be intimately acquainted with every detail of a world and still be barred from entering it. The cruelty lies not in the distance, but in the closeness. In the weeks that followed, the household became a theater of preparation. Dance masters arrived to refine the girls' deportment. Elocution tutors drilled them on conversational topics suitable for polite company. Lady Beatrice hosted small gatherings, tea with the daughters of other prominent families, afternoon calls with mothers who controlled access to the best social circles, and Caroline and Dorothea learned the delicate art of making themselves memorable without appearing to try. Eliza helped. Not because she was asked, but because her presence was assumed. "Eliza, would you fetch Caroline's gloves from the dresser?" "Eliza, Dorothea's hem needs adjusting. You have steadier hands than the maid." "Eliza, we're running late and I need someone to ensure the girls' jewels are properly secured before we depart." She became a pair of hands. A repository of useful information. The person who knew where things were kept, how things were done, what was required and when. She knew the precise angle at which a fan should be held to signal interest without impropriety. She knew which dance card should be filled first, and which partners should be politely declined. She knew that a lady never arrived first to any event, but never last either. There was a mathematics to social visibility that required arriving at the exact moment one would be noticed, but not examined. She knew all of this because she had studied it the way one might study ancient Greek, with the understanding that it was beautiful, complex, and utterly irrelevant to one's own life. One evening, 3 weeks before the Grosvenor ball, Eliza was in Dorothea's room helping to arrange her hair. They had sent the lady's maid away. Dorothea claimed the woman pulled too tightly, and so it fell to Eliza to pin the elaborate curls that required both patience and precision. "You're good at this," Dorothea said, watching in the mirror. "Better than Martine." Eliza said nothing. Compliments from Dorothea were rare and usually preceded requests. "Why aren't you coming to the ball?" The question was asked lightly, but Eliza's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. "Your mother believes it's for the best." "Yes, but why?" "Because I have been deemed unsuitable. Because my presence would complicate the narrative being carefully constructed around your debut. Because a girl with no dowry and no prospects is a liability in a room full of mothers calculating advantages. Because," Eliza said carefully, "there are limited resources, and they are best spent on those who will benefit most from them." It was the answer she had been given. Rephrased, softened, but essentially unchanged. Dorothea studied her in the mirror. For a moment, Eliza thought she might press further. But then her attention drifted back to her own reflection, to the arrangement of curls, to the question of whether the pearl combs should be positioned higher or lower. "I suppose that makes sense," Dorothea said. And Eliza understood that it did, to everyone but her. The night before the ball, Lady Beatrice summoned Eliza to her private sitting room. This was unusual enough to set Eliza's pulse racing, though she kept her expression carefully neutral as she entered. Her stepmother was seated at her writing desk, a ledger open before her, though she closed it as Eliza approached. "Sit, darling." "Eliza Saturday. I want you to know," Lady Beatrice began, "that I am not unaware of the sacrifices you've made. Your discretion. Your understanding. It speaks well of your character." Eliza waited. Tomorrow will be difficult for you, I imagine. Staying behind while the rest of us attend the ball. But I hope you understand, truly understand, that this is not a reflection of your worth. It is simply a matter of timing, of resources, of ensuring the best possible outcome for all of us. All of us. As though Eliza were included in that calculation. You will have your turn, Lady Beatrice continued, when circumstances are more favorable, when the girls are settled, when we can afford to. She stopped herself. Afford to what? Acknowledge her existence. Present her to society. Admit that she, too, might deserve a place in the world her father's name should have guaranteed her. But Lady Beatrice recovered smoothly. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over Eliza's, a gesture that might have looked affectionate to anyone observing. You are a good girl, Eliza. And goodness is always rewarded. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. The word hung in the air between them. Eventually. Which was, Eliza understood, another way of saying never. That night, alone in her room, Eliza stood before her small mirror and tried to imagine what she might have looked like in silk and pearls. Whether her hair, arranged properly, might have caught the candlelight. Whether she might have learned the same practiced ease her stepsisters wore like expensive perfume. Whether anyone would have noticed her, or whether she would have remained invisible even in a ballroom full of people trained to see only what they wished to see. But the exercise felt pointless. She was not going to the ball. She would remain here, in this small room, while the rest of the world assembled to judge worth and assign value and determine futures. And no one, she was certain of this, would notice her absence. The most efficient erasures are the ones performed with the victim's consent. One need not lock the door if one can convince the prisoner that the room she occupies is the only room she deserves. But every cage, no matter how gilded or invisible, requires only one thing to remain effective: the belief that escape is impossible. The most effective prisons are built not with bars, but with concern. The morning of the Grosvenor ball arrived with unseasonable rain. Eliza woke to the sound of it against her window, steady, persistent, the kind of rain that would turn the streets to mud and ruin hems and make carriage travel miserable for everyone involved. She lay still for a moment, listening, and felt something she could not quite name settle in her chest. Not relief, exactly, but perhaps something adjacent to it. If the weather was bad enough, perhaps the ball would be postponed. Perhaps Lady Beatrice would decide the risk to the girls' gowns was too great. Perhaps. But no. The season did not bend to weather. It did not bend to anything so inconvenient as reality. The ball would proceed. And Eliza would remain here. She dressed carefully that morning, not because she had anywhere to go, but because routine was a form of dignity. The same simple morning dress she wore most days. The same arrangement of her hair, pinned back with the plainness that had become her signature. When she descended to breakfast, she found the household already in motion. Lady Beatrice was directing the staff with the precision of a field marshal. The girls' gowns needed to be checked for any damage from storage. The carriage needed to be inspected. They would depart at 7, not a moment earlier, not a moment later, and there were still 1,000 details to be attended to. Eliza took her tea in silence. Good morning, Eliza. She looked up. Lady Beatrice stood in the doorway, already dressed though it was barely 9 o'clock, her expression one of gentle concern. I trust you slept well. Yes, thank you. I'm glad. Lady Beatrice moved into the room with that particular grace she possessed, the kind that made every gesture seem both effortless and deliberate. I wanted to speak with you before the day became too chaotic. Eliza set down her cup. I've been thinking, Lady Beatrice continued, settling into the chair opposite, about how difficult today must be for you. Watching everyone prepare. Knowing you won't be joining us. Eliza said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound either ungrateful or pathetic. I want you to understand why I've made this decision. Not because I owe you an explanation, though perhaps I do, but because I care about you, Eliza. Truly. The words were spoken with such apparent sincerity that Eliza felt something in her throat tighten. You are not like Caroline and Dorothea, Lady Beatrice said. You never have been. They are resilient, thick-skinned. They can withstand scrutiny without crumbling. But you, darling, you are more delicate, more sensitive. Delicate. The word had been used before, always with this same tone of worried affection. Society is not kind to those who cannot defend themselves, Lady Beatrice continued. The ballroom is a battlefield, however pretty it may appear. Women are judged for everything, their appearance, their wit, their family connections, their dowries. And those who are found wanting, well, the ton has a long memory, Eliza. A cruel one. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. I have watched young women destroyed by a single season. Girls who entered with hope and left with nothing but humiliation. Girls who made one misstep, wore the wrong color, said the wrong thing, danced with the wrong partner, and were never invited anywhere of consequence again. Eliza's hands were folded in her lap. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. Is that what you want for yourself? To be exposed to that kind of judgment? To be compared, because you would be compared, Eliza, constantly and unfavorably, to girls with advantages you simply do not possess? The question hung in the air. I am trying, Lady Beatrice said softly, to protect you. From disappointment. From pain. From the very real possibility that you would be overlooked, ignored, or worse, pitied. Because that is what happens to girls who are not quite ready. Not quite ready. As though readiness were something that could be acquired through waiting. As though Eliza's absence from society were a kindness rather than a calculation. You understand, don't you? Lady Beatrice's voice was gentle. I am not excluding you to be cruel. I am excluding you to spare you. Because I know, Eliza, that you are not equipped for this. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. And there it was. The lie, delivered with such tenderness that it almost felt like truth. You are too fragile. The world will hurt you. I am protecting you by keeping you small. Eliza heard herself say, I understand. Because what else could she say? That she did not believe she was fragile? That she suspected the real reason for her exclusion had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with resource allocation? That she had learned, over years of careful observation, that the ton was no crueler to those without advantages than it was to anyone else, it simply ignored them, which was different, and perhaps more honest? But voicing any of this would require challenging the woman who controlled every aspect of her life. And Eliza had learned long ago that challenge was not a luxury afforded to those without options. So she said, I understand, and watched her stepmother's expression soften into something that resembled relief. I knew you would. Lady Beatrice reached across and squeezed Eliza's hand. You are such a good girl. So reasonable. So accommodating. The praise felt like a collar tightening. Now, Lady Beatrice continued, rising, I must attend to the 1,000 details that remain. But I want you to know, tonight, while we're gone, you are not to feel sorry for yourself. You are to rest. Read. Perhaps write to your aunt in Bath. This is not a punishment, Eliza. It is mercy. She left the room with that same effortless grace. And Eliza sat alone with her cold tea and the word that kept echoing in her mind. Mercy. There are many ways to cage a person. Iron bars are the most obvious, but also the clumsiest. Far more effective is the cage built of concern, of careful words and worried glances and the repeated insistence that the world beyond is too dangerous for one so delicate. The prisoner, in such cases, rarely attempts escape. She has been taught that the cage is safety, that the world beyond would destroy her, that she should be grateful for such protection. And if, occasionally, she suspects that the protection is serving someone else's interests more than her own, well, such suspicions are easily dismissed as ingratitude. The afternoon was a blur of activity that Eliza observed from the margins. The girls' hair was arranged and rearranged. Their gowns were inspected with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for military equipment. Lady Beatrice moved through the house like a conductor before a performance, ensuring every element was in place, every detail attended to. Eliza helped where she was needed, fastening clasps, retrieving forgotten items, holding mirrors at angles that allowed for final inspections. She had become remarkably good at being useful without being visible. "You look beautiful," she told Caroline, and meant it. The ivory silk caught the light exactly as intended. The pearl beading at the bodice was understated but unmistakably expensive. Caroline's hair was arranged in soft curls that framed her face without overwhelming it. She looked like what she was, a young woman who had been carefully prepared for public evaluation and found adequate. "Thank you, Eliza." Caroline's tone was kind, if distant. She was already focused on the evening ahead, on the partners she hoped to secure, the impressions she hoped to make. Dorothea, by contrast, could barely stand still. "Do you think Lord Ashworth will be there?" she asked for the third time. "Mamma says he's looking to marry this season. And his estate is enormous." "Dorothea." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the chatter. "A lady does not speculate about such things aloud. Especially not tonight." Dorothea subsided, but her excitement was palpable. Eliza felt something twist in her chest, not envy, exactly, but something close to it. A wondering. A what if? What if she had been the one preparing for this evening? What if she had been given gowns and jewels and the confidence that came from being told, repeatedly, that she was worthy of attention? What if she had been permitted to believe that she, too, might be chosen? But the thought was pointless. She was not going. And no amount of wondering would change that. At 6:30, Lady Beatrice summoned her to the drawing-room. The family was assembled, Caroline and Dorothea in their finery, Lady Beatrice in deep blue silk that suggested both wealth and restraint. They looked like a painting, a composition carefully arranged to communicate status. And Eliza, in her simple day dress, stood at the edge of the frame. "Before we depart," Lady Beatrice said, "I want to give you something." She crossed to the writing desk and retrieved a small leather-bound volume. "I thought you might enjoy this tonight. It's a collection of essays, nothing scandalous, of course, but engaging enough to pass the time. I know how you enjoy reading." She placed the book in Eliza's hands with a smile that looked, to anyone observing, like affection. But Eliza understood what it was. A consolation prize. A reminder that while others lived, she was permitted to observe life through the safer medium of text. "Thank you," she said. Because what else could she say? Lady Beatrice studied her for a moment, and Eliza wondered if she saw through the performance, if she understood that Eliza had learned to play the role assigned to her not out of gratitude, but out of survival. But if she did, she gave no sign. "Well then." Lady Beatrice turned to her daughters. "Shall we?" They departed in a rustle of silk and anticipation. And Eliza stood in the drawing-room, holding a book she would not read, listening to the sound of the carriage pulling away. The house, without them, was very quiet. The servants had mostly retired to their own quarters, the evening would be long, and there was no point in maintaining full staff for a household of one. Eliza climbed the stairs slowly, the book still in her hands, and made her way to the small sitting-room on the second floor. It was the room she had occupied during Caroline's and Dorothea's fittings. The room where she had taken notes she was never asked to produce. The room that had become, by default, hers, because no one else wanted it. She settled into the chair by the window and looked out at the rain, which had not stopped. Somewhere across the city, carriages were arriving at the Grosvenor estate. Guests were being announced. The ballroom was filling with people who had been deemed worthy of attendance. And here she sat today, safe, according to Lady Beatrice, protected from the cruelty of scrutiny, spared the pain of comparison. But as Eliza sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the rain and the silence, she wondered, not for the first time, whether protection and erasure were really so different. Whether being kept safe from the world was meaningfully distinct from being kept from the world entirely. Whether her stepmother had ever truly believed she was too delicate for society, or whether that had simply been the most palatable way to explain why Eliza's presence would be inconvenient. The thought circled, familiar and useless. because understanding what had been done to her did not change the fact that it had been done, and suspecting that she had been manipulated did not grant her the power to resist the manipulation. So she sat a day, and waited, and told herself that this was mercy. The most insidious cruelty is the kind that convinces its victim that she deserves it, that frames her erasure as care, that teaches her to be grateful for her own diminishment. And if, in her quietest moments, she begins to suspect the truth, well, by then, she has often forgotten that she was ever meant to exist any other way. There are many forms of solitude, but the loneliest is perhaps the kind experienced while music plays in another room. By 8 o'clock, the rain had stopped. Eliza stood at the window of the small sitting room and watched the sky clear, revealing stars that seemed unnaturally bright after the storm. The streets below glistened with wetness, reflecting lamplight in long, wavering lines. The city felt alive tonight. She could sense it even from here, the pulse of gatherings, the hum of voices and music and laughter emanating from houses lit like lanterns. The season in full motion. Society assembled to perform its rituals of evaluation and selection. And she was here, alone. She had tried to read. The book Lady Beatrice had given her lay open on the side table, but the words refused to arrange themselves into meaning. Her mind kept drifting to the ball, to what was happening there, to who was dancing with whom, to whether Caroline had secured Lord Pembroke's attention, whether Dorothea had remembered not to laugh too loudly, whether anyone had noticed that the Harcourt family had arrived with only 2 daughters instead of 3. She suspected not. One learned, after years of invisibility, that absence was easier to overlook than presence. At 8:30, she heard the music. It came from the direction of Grosvenor Square, faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. The opening strains of a waltz. She knew the piece. Had heard it practiced by the musicians her stepmother had hired to tutor the girls in proper dancing. Eliza stood and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. She could not see the Grosvenor house from here. It was 3 streets away, obscured by buildings and trees. But she could imagine it. The chandeliers blazing. The ballroom filled with silken jewels and carefully arranged faces. The dancers moving in synchronized patterns, each step a negotiation of status and desire. The music swelled, and Eliza felt something crack open in her chest. Not rage. She had learned that rage was an expensive emotion, one she could not afford. Not even sadness, precisely. Just longing. A wanting so sharp it felt physical. She wanted to be there. Not to be the most beautiful woman in the room, not to secure the most advantageous match. Simply to be there. To exist in that space. To be seen, acknowledged, considered as someone who might matter. To dance. Even once. Even poorly. To know what it felt like to be chosen rather than hidden. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. 9 o'clock. The first dances would be complete. Partners would be changing. Conversations forming and dissolving in the spaces between sets. 10 o'clock. Refreshments would be served. Lady Beatrice would be circulating, making introductions, ensuring her daughters were positioned near the right families. 11 o'clock. The informal rankings would be solidifying. Some girls would be surrounded. Others would be standing with their mothers, smiles fixed, pretending not to notice the men who looked past them. Eliza wondered which category her stepsisters occupied. She wondered if they were thinking of her at all. She suspected not. At midnight, she heard the front door open. The sound jolted her from the half-trance she had fallen into. She had been sitting in darkness, had not bothered to light the lamps, and now she stood quickly, disoriented. Voices in the hall below. Female. Multiple. They were home. Eliza moved to the doorway of the sitting room but did not descend. Something in her resisted the idea of greeting them, of having to arrange her face into appropriate curiosity, of having to listen to their excitement while pretending her own evening had been equally fulfilling. So she remained where she was, in shadow, and listened. Absolutely divine, Mamma. Did you see how he looked at me during the second waltz? Dorothea's voice, breathless with triumph. I saw. Lady Beatrice's tone was pleased. Lord Ashworth is clearly interested. But Dorothea, you must remember, interest is not a proposal. Do not grow too confident. But surely. Dorothea. Silence. Then Caroline's voice, quieter. Lord Pembroke asked after our family. Specifically, he wanted to know about Papa's estate. Excellent. Lady Beatrice sounded satisfied. I expected as much. He is nothing if not practical. Caroline, you handled that beautifully. Exactly the right balance of modesty and clarity. Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the house. Eliza stood in the darkness of the sitting room and felt the weight of the evening settle over her like a physical thing. They had not mentioned her. Had not wondered how she passed her time. Had not, even for a moment, acknowledged that their evening of triumph had required her absence. She had been erased so thoroughly that even her erasure went unremarked upon. She did not go downstairs. Instead, she returned to the window and looked out at the city, at the lights still burning in windows across the square, at the carriages still making their way through streets, at the evidence of a world that continued to turn without her. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, what her life would be. This. Always this. Watching from windows while others lived. Helping others prepare for moments she would never experience. Existing in the margins of a household that had decided, long ago, that she was more useful invisible than present. Lady Beatrice had been right about one thing. Society was cruel. But not in the way she had claimed. The cruelty was not in the judgment or the scrutiny or the comparison. The cruelty was in the exclusion itself. In being told, through action if not words, that one did not deserve even the chance to be judged. That one's worth had been predetermined as insufficient. That one's absence was not just acceptable but preferable. That one had been born into a world that would never make space for her. Eliza pressed her forehead against the window glass. The music had stopped long ago. The ball would be ending now. Carriages departing. Young women returning home with their fates slightly more determined than they had been 6 hours earlier. And tomorrow, life would continue. Lady Beatrice would assess the evening's successes and failures. Caroline and Dorothea would receive calls from interested parties. Strategies would be refined. Invitations would be accepted or declined based on careful calculation. And Eliza would remain here. In this room. By this window. Watching. Because that, she now understood, was all she would ever be permitted to do. The music plays. The dancers turn. And in an upstairs room, in a house that holds her but does not claim her, a young woman sits in darkness and learns what it means to be forgotten. Not through absence, but through presence. Not through distance, but through proximity. The cruelest exile is the one that happens while everyone pretends you still belong. There are those who enter rooms to be seen. And then there are those who enter rooms to see. The distinction is subtle but absolute. Earl Nathaniel Blackwood had arrived at the Grosvenor ball precisely 15 minutes after the dancing began. This was deliberate. Arrived too early and one became entrapped in tedious greetings. Too late and one risked appearing either desperate or dismissive. 15 minutes struck the balance between presence and autonomy. The ballroom was already full when he entered, chandeliers blazing, silk catching light, the air thick with perfume and calculation. It was the pinnacle of the season, the event where futures were negotiated under the guise of entertainment. Which meant everyone here was performing. Nathaniel paused at the threshold and observed. Mothers positioned along the perimeter like generals. Young women arranged in careful clusters. Men circulating with studied casualness, evaluating options with the efficiency of buyers at market. He had long since grown weary of theatre. At 32, he was old enough to be considered established, young enough that his unmarried status still raised comment. He received invitations to everything. Mothers introduced their daughters with transparent hope. The daughters themselves performed their rehearsed accomplishments, pianoforte, watercolors, French phrases at strategic intervals. None of it interested him. Not because the young women were inadequate, but because courtship rituals revealed nothing of consequence. One learned how well a woman could dance, how pleasantly she could discuss weather. One did not learn whether she possessed a mind worth engaging, whether she saw the world as it was or merely as she had been taught to describe it. So Nathaniel attended these events with decreasing frequency and increasing detachment. He moved through the ballroom with practiced ease, deflecting dance invitations with polite firmness. His friend, Viscount Hartley, found him near the refreshment table. "You're late," Hartley observed. "I'm precisely on time. Lady Pemberton has been asking after you. She wishes to introduce you to her niece." Nathaniel took a sip of champagne. "How unfortunate for Lady Pemberton." Hartley laughed. "You're in a mood." "I'm in the same mood I'm always in at these affairs. Present but unconvinced." They stood watching the dancers. Nathaniel's gaze drifted across the room, cataloguing faces automatically. The Winters sisters, both married now. Lord Ashworth dancing with someone new. Lady Beatrice Harcourt positioned near the centre with territorial confidence, her two daughters orbiting her. Something about that configuration caught his attention. He frowned. "Harcourt family," he said slowly. "How many daughters?" Hartley considered. "Two, I believe. Caroline and Dorothea." "Why?" "Thomas Harcourt. Before he died." "How many children?" "One daughter, I think. From his first marriage." Hartley's brow furrowed. "Actually, yes. I remember now. There was talk when he remarried, about the girl being quite young when her mother died." Nathaniel's frown deepened. "And yet Lady Beatrice presents only two daughters." "Well, the other two are hers from her first marriage. Perhaps the Harcourt girl is too young? Or," Hartley shrugged, "perhaps she's simply not here." "Why would she not be here? Does it matter?" It was a reasonable question. One daughter's absence from a ball should not warrant this much attention. And yet Nathaniel found himself troubled by it in a way he could not quite articulate. Because absence, when deliberate, always told a story. And Lady Beatrice Harcourt did not strike him as someone who made decisions without calculation. The evening progressed with predictable monotony. Nathaniel danced when required, twice with young women whose mothers had cornered him, once with Lady Grosvenor herself out of courtesy. He made conversation. He smiled at appropriate intervals. He fulfilled his obligations with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed these rituals too many times to find them meaningful. But his mind kept returning to the Harcourt family, to the space where a third daughter should have been. He found himself watching Lady Beatrice more carefully than the situation warranted. She was skilled at what she did, positioning her daughters near advantageous partners, facilitating introductions without appearing to orchestrate them, maintaining the delicate fiction that everything unfolding was spontaneous rather than strategic. Both daughters were accomplished performers. Caroline had a certain placid prettiness that would photograph well in miniatures. Dorothea possessed more animation, too much, perhaps, judging by the way Lady Beatrice periodically touched her arm in gentle correction. They were exactly what they were supposed to be, which made the absence of the third daughter more conspicuous. During a break between dances, Nathaniel approached Lady Beatrice directly. She turned toward him with practiced warmth, her smile calibrated to suggest both deference and confidence. "Lord Blackwood, how delightful to see you this evening." "Lady Harcourt." He inclined his head. "Your daughters seem to be enjoying themselves." "They are. It's their first major ball of the season. Such an exciting time." "Indeed." He paused, then said with deliberate casualness, "I had the pleasure of knowing your late husband slightly. Thomas Harcourt was a good man." Something flickered across her expression, too quick to identify, but there nonetheless. "He was," she said carefully. "His loss was a great sadness. He had a daughter, I believe, from his first marriage." The flicker again. Longer this time. Then her smile returned, softer now, tinged with what appeared to be concern. "Yes. Eliza. Sweet girl." She lowered her voice slightly, as though sharing something confidential. "She is not quite ready for this sort of event, I'm afraid. The scrutiny can be overwhelming for those of a delicate temperament. I thought it best to wait another season. Perhaps two." The explanation was delivered with perfect maternal solicitude, and Nathaniel did not believe a word of it. Not because it was implausible, there were certainly young women who found society overwhelming, but because of the way Lady Beatrice held herself as she spoke. The slight tension in her shoulders, the too careful modulation of her voice. She was lying. Or if not lying, then omitting something essential. "How considerate of you," he said, "to protect her from premature exposure. A mother's duty." Lady Beatrice's smile warmed. "Now, Lord Blackwood, I don't suppose you've had the pleasure of dancing with Caroline yet? She's quite accomplished." He excused himself politely. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of meaningless conversation and mechanical dancing. But Nathaniel's mind was elsewhere, on a girl he had never met, who had been deliberately kept from an event where she should, by all rights, have been present, whose absence had been explained away with the kind of practiced concern that suggested years of refinement, whose erasure had been so complete that no one else seemed to have noticed it at all. He left the ball early, earlier than was strictly polite, but late enough to avoid giving offence. And as his carriage made its way through the London streets, Nathaniel found himself thinking not about the women he had danced with, or the conversations he had endured, or the offers he had deflected, but about the one person who had not been there at all. The question that changes everything is rarely complicated. Sometimes it is as simple as, who is missing? And once that question is asked, it cannot be unasked. The absence becomes impossible to ignore. Visibility, when one has learned to survive through absence, feels like exposure. But exposure is not always dangerous. Sometimes it is simply true. 3 days after the Grosvenor ball, Lady Beatrice summoned Eliza to the morning room with unusual urgency. "We're expecting a caller this afternoon," she said without preamble. "Lord Blackwood, the Earl." Eliza looked up from the embroidery she had been pretending to work on. "I see. He has expressed interest in calling on Caroline." Lady Beatrice's tone carried forced lightness, which is quite promising. The man is notoriously selective. If he's taken notice of her, it could mean, well, it could mean a great deal. She paused, studying Eliza with an expression that was difficult to parse. "I need you to remain upstairs during his visit. In your room. The household will be occupied with receiving him properly, and I cannot have distractions." Distractions. The word settled between them. "Of course," Eliza said. Lady Beatrice's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good girl. I knew you'd understand." At 3 o'clock precisely, the Earl's carriage arrived. Eliza watched from her bedroom window as he descended, tall, dark-haired, moving with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to question one's place in the world. He glanced up at the house briefly, and for a moment Eliza had the irrational fear that he could see her watching. She stepped back from the window. Below, she heard the front door open. Voices in the hall. The carefully choreographed ritual of receiving a caller of significance. And then silence as they presumably moved to the drawing room. Eliza sat on the edge of her bed and waited. She was good at waiting. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. "Miss Eliza." It was Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper. "Your stepmother requires you in the drawing room immediately." Eliza's stomach tightened. "I thought, she said I should remain." "I know what she said, miss. But she's asking for you now. And she seems—" Mrs. Davies hesitated. Agitated. This was unprecedented. Eliza rose, smoothed her dress, the same simple morning dress she had worn for the past 2 days, and followed Mrs. Davies down the stairs with growing apprehension. When she entered the drawing room, she understood immediately that something had gone wrong. Lady Beatrice stood near the window, her posture rigid. Caroline sat on the settee looking confused. Dorothea was absent, presumably at her music lesson. And the Earl stood in the center of the room, his attention fixed not on Caroline, but on the doorway through which Eliza had just entered. "Ah," he said. "Miss Harcourt, I presume." His voice was measured, polite. But there was something in his gaze that made Eliza's breath catch, an intensity that felt like being studied rather than merely observed. "Yes," she managed. "Lord Blackwood has asked to meet you," Lady Beatrice said, her voice tight. "I explained that you were indisposed, but he was quite insistent." "I apologize if I've caused inconvenience," the Earl said, though his tone suggested no apology whatsoever. "But when I learned that Thomas Harcourt's daughter resided in this household, I felt it would be remiss not to pay my respects. Your father and I were acquainted, Miss Harcourt. Briefly, but I remember him with fondness." It was a lie. Or perhaps not a lie, but certainly a pretense. Eliza could see it in the way Lady Beatrice's jaw tightened, in the way Caroline's eyes widened slightly. This was not why the Earl had come calling, and everyone in the room knew it. But he had maneuvered Lady Beatrice into a position where refusing him access to Eliza would have been obviously suspicious. And so here they were. "That's very kind of you to remember him," Eliza said carefully. "He spoke highly of many acquaintances. I'm sure you were among them." The Earl's mouth curved slightly. "Did he?" "I assume so. I was quite young when he died." "Yes. I imagine that must have been difficult." There was something in the way he said it, not perfunctory sympathy, but genuine acknowledgement. As though he understood that difficulty could take many forms, some of them ongoing. Lady Beatrice moved forward, attempting to reclaim control of the situation. "Lord Blackwood, how gracious of you to remember Thomas. Eliza, I'm sure the Earl has other calls to make." "Actually," the Earl said, not looking at Lady Beatrice, "I was wondering if Miss Harcourt might join us for tea. Since I'm already here, and the weather is quite pleasant." The silence that followed was excruciating. Eliza watched her stepmother's face undergo a series of minute calculations. To refuse would be rude, would invite questions about why Eliza was being deliberately excluded from a simple tea with a family acquaintance. To agree would be to surrender control over a situation that was already spiraling beyond her management. "Of course," Lady Beatrice said finally, her smile glacial. "How lovely. Eliza, do sit down." The tea that followed was one of the strangest experiences of Eliza's life. Caroline attempted to engage the Earl in conversation about the Grosvenor ball, about mutual acquaintances, about upcoming events, about anything that might recapture his attention. She was skilled at it, deployed every technique she had been taught. But the Earl's attention kept drifting back to Eliza. Not obviously. He was too practiced for that. But in the pauses between Caroline's observations, in the moments when Lady Beatrice was pouring tea, his gaze would shift to where Eliza sat in the chair she had been directed to, the one farthest from the center of the room. "Miss Harcourt," he said eventually, interrupting one of Caroline's anecdotes about a mutual acquaintance, "do you attend many social events?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "No," Eliza said simply. "By choice." Lady Beatrice's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "By circumstance," Eliza said carefully. "I see." The Earl leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "And do you enjoy London? Or do you prefer the country?" "I haven't been to the country in several years." "Ah. Then you must enjoy London very much." "I didn't say that." The words were out before Eliza could stop them. She felt Lady Beatrice's sharp intake of breath, saw Caroline's eyes widen. But the Earl simply smiled. Not the polite smile he had been offering Caroline. Something different. Something that suggested he had just confirmed a hypothesis. "No," he said quietly. "You didn't." He stayed for precisely 30 minutes, the appropriate duration for an afternoon call. When he rose to leave, he thanked Lady Beatrice for her hospitality, complimented Caroline on her conversation, and then turned to Eliza. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Miss Harcourt. I hope we might have the opportunity to speak again." "That's very kind of you," Lady Beatrice interjected quickly, "but Eliza's schedule is quite—" "I'm sure we can arrange something," the Earl said pleasantly. "Good afternoon, ladies." He left, and Eliza sat in the sudden silence, feeling her stepmother's fury like a physical presence. "What," Lady Beatrice said very softly, "did you say to him before he arrived?" "Nothing. I've never met him before today." "Then why—" She stopped herself, visibly collecting her composure. "Eliza, go to your room. We will discuss this later." Eliza rose and left without argument. But as she climbed the stairs, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Because for the first time in years, someone had looked directly at her and seen what was there. Not what she had been taught to present. Not what others wanted her to be. But the truth of her, the resentment, the intelligence, the quiet refusal to perform gratitude for her own diminishment. He had seen it. And he had not looked away. There is a difference between being looked at and being seen. The former is passive, decorative, requires nothing but surface. The latter demands presence, recognition, the acknowledgement that what stands before you is real. And once you have been truly seen, invisibility becomes impossible. Power is most visible not when it is exercised loudly, but when it is exercised in defiance of those who believed they controlled the room. The invitation arrived 2 days after the Earl's visit. Lady Pemberton was hosting a garden party, one of the season's more anticipated events, as her estate boasted grounds extensive enough to accommodate lawn games, a substantial refreshment pavilion, and the kind of strategic mingling that made such gatherings more valuable than formal balls. The invitation was addressed to Lady Beatrice Harcourt and family. And family. Eliza stared at the heavy cardstock as Lady Beatrice turned it over in her hands, her expression unreadable. "How comprehensive," her stepmother said finally. "Does that mean I'm to attend?" Eliza's voice was carefully neutral. Lady Beatrice set the invitation down with deliberate precision. "It would appear that Lady Pemberton has extended her hospitality to the entire household. It would be rude to decline on your behalf without cause." There was a long pause. "However," Lady Beatrice continued, her tone sharpening, "you will conduct yourself appropriately. You will not monopolize anyone's attention. You will not presume familiarity with guests above your station. And you will remember that this invitation is a courtesy, not an acknowledgement of equivalence." Eliza nodded. She understood perfectly what was being communicated. You may attend, but do not mistake attendance for acceptance. The morning of the garden party, Eliza stood before her wardrobe with something approaching despair. She owned precisely 3 dresses suitable for public appearance, all of them at least 2 seasons out of fashion. The best of them, a pale blue muslin with modest embroidery, had been altered twice already and was beginning to show the strain of repeated adjustments. It would have to suffice. She dressed with care, arranging her hair in a simple style that required no assistance. When she descended the stairs, she found Caroline and Dorothea already waiting in the entrance hall, resplendent in new gowns that made Eliza's dress look even more obviously shabby by comparison. Lady Beatrice's gaze swept over Eliza with barely concealed dissatisfaction. "That will do," she said, in a tone that suggested it would not, in fact, do at all. They departed in silence. The Pemberton estate was everything one expected of old money: manicured lawns, ancient trees providing artful shade, flower beds arranged with mathematical precision. Guests had already begun to arrive, clustering in groups that shifted and reformed like living organisms responding to some invisible current. Eliza followed her family through the grounds, maintaining the distance she had learned was appropriate. Caroline and Dorothea were quickly absorbed into conversations with other young women. Lady Beatrice positioned herself near Lady Pemberton, engaging in the kind of strategic conversation that would ensure her daughters remained visible to the right people. And Eliza stood at the periphery, as she always had. She told herself this was familiar, comfortable, even. She knew how to occupy space without claiming it, how to observe without participating. But something had shifted since the Earl's visit. She could feel eyes on her occasionally, curious glances from people who had perhaps heard that Thomas Harcourt's daughter existed but had never seen evidence of her. The attention made her skin prickle with discomfort. Visibility, she was discovering, was not the gift she had imagined it might be. She was standing near a rose trellis, half hidden and grateful for it, when she heard his voice. "Miss Harcourt." She turned to find the Earl approaching, accompanied by Viscount Hartley. Both men were dressed impeccably, moving through the gardens with the casual authority of those who had never questioned their right to occupy space. "Lord Blackwood," she managed, offering a small curtsy. "I'm pleased to see you in attendance," he said. "When Lady Beatrice mentioned your schedule was quite occupied, I worried you might not be able to join us." There was something in the way he said it, perfectly polite, but with an edge that suggested he knew exactly what Lady Beatrice's objections had been. "I was fortunate to have the afternoon available," Eliza said carefully. "Indeed." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Are you enjoying the gardens? Lady Pemberton's roses are particularly fine this year." "They're beautiful." "But you were standing here alone." It was not a question. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was appreciating them." A solitary appreciation. He paused. "Miss Harcourt, would you care to walk with me? Hartley has been tediously prosing on about his new hunter, and I require rescue." "I have not," Hartley protested, but he was grinning. Eliza's mind raced. To accept would be to make herself conspicuous. To refuse would be to insult a man who had shown her more consideration in 2 meetings than most people had in years. "I would be honored," she said quietly. They walked along the garden paths, Hartley accompanying them initially before being summoned by his sister and departing with an apologetic bow, which left Eliza alone with the Earl. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, exactly, but weighted with things unsaid. Around them, the party continued. Laughter drifted from nearby groups. The clink of glasses. The rustle of silk and the crunch of gravel underfoot. "You're wondering why I sought you out," the Earl said finally. Eliza glanced at him. "Yes. I appreciate the honesty. You didn't seem like someone who would value elaborate pretense." He laughed, a genuine sound that startled her. "No, I suppose I wouldn't." "Very well then. Honesty. I sought you out because I find you more interesting than anyone else here." She stopped walking. "You don't know me. I know that you were deliberately excluded from the Grosvenor ball. I know that your stepmother attempted to prevent me from meeting you. I know that when I asked if you enjoyed London, you refused to lie and tell me you did." He turned to face her fully. "I know that you have been taught to make yourself invisible, and that you are exceptionally skilled at it. But I also know that you resent it." The words landed like physical blows. Eliza felt her breath catch, felt the familiar urge to retreat, to deflect, to make herself smaller. But she didn't. "Yes," she said instead. "I resent it." "Good. Good. Yes. Because resentment suggests you haven't accepted it as deserved. That you still understand, somewhere beneath all the training, that you were meant for something other than erasure." Eliza stared at him. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever suggested that her anger, so carefully suppressed, so thoroughly denied, might be justified. "Why do you care?" The question came out more sharply than she intended. "Because I'm tired of watching people perform," he said simply. "And you're the first person I've met in years who seems incapable of it." They continued walking, and Eliza became gradually aware that people were watching them. Not overtly. But she could feel the shift in attention, the way conversations paused as they passed, the way eyes followed their progress through the gardens. The Earl walking with Miss Harcourt. Not with Caroline, who had been the presumed object of his interest. But with the daughter no one was supposed to notice. Lady Beatrice appeared on the path ahead of them, her smile fixed in place but her eyes glacial. Lord Blackwood, how lovely to see you. I hope Eliza isn't monopolizing your time. I'm sure there are many other guests who would value your attention. Miss Harcourt has been excellent company, the Earl said pleasantly. We were just discussing literature. She has remarkable insight into Gothic novels. Do you know she's read The Mysteries of Udolpho 3 times? Eliza hadn't mentioned that. Hadn't mentioned reading at all. He was lying for her, creating a narrative that made their conversation sound intellectual rather than personal. Lady Beatrice's smile tightened. How scholarly. Well, I'm sure you have other obligations. Actually, the Earl said, I was hoping Miss Harcourt might join me for refreshments. If that's agreeable to you both, of course. It was not a request. Not really. And Lady Beatrice, surrounded by people who were now openly watching this exchange, could not refuse without creating exactly the kind of scene she had spent years avoiding. Of course, she said, her voice strangled. The Earl offered Eliza his arm. She took it. And as they walked toward the refreshment pavilion, with the entire party watching, Eliza understood that something fundamental had shifted. She had been hidden her entire life. And now, in the most public venue possible, she had been chosen. Not for her beauty. Not for her accomplishments. Not even despite her shabby dress and lack of social polish. But because someone had noticed her absence and decided it mattered. Recognition, when it comes after years of erasure, feels like both gift and threat. Because once the room has seen you, they cannot unsee you. And neither can you. Freedom, when first experienced, is often mistaken for danger. Because the cage, however small, was familiar. And the world beyond it is not. The carriage ride home was silent. Lady Beatrice sat rigid, staring out the window with an expression carved from ice. Caroline and Dorothea exchanged confused glances but said nothing. And Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of what had happened settle over her like a physical thing. She had been seen, chosen, made visible in the most public way possible. And she had no idea what came next. When they arrived home, Lady Beatrice swept into the house without a word. Caroline and Dorothea disappeared upstairs, whispering to each other. And Eliza stood alone in the entrance hall, uncertain whether she should follow or wait or simply vanish back into the spaces she had occupied before. Eliza. Her stepmother's voice came from the drawing room. Not loud, but absolute. Eliza entered. Lady Beatrice stood by the fireplace, her posture perfect, her hands clasped loosely before her. But there was something in her eyes that Eliza had never seen before. Not anger. Fear. Sit down, Lady Beatrice said. Eliza Saturday. I have spent years, Lady Beatrice began, her voice measured, ensuring this family's position. Managing limited resources. Making difficult decisions that you, in your innocence, could not possibly understand. She paused. Every choice I have made has been in service of stability, of security, of ensuring that we, all of us, have futures. Eliza said nothing. You were not excluded from society to punish you, Eliza. You were excluded because there was not enough. Not enough money for 3 debuts. Not enough social capital to launch 3 daughters into marriages of consequence. Choices had to be made. And I was the choice, Eliza said quietly. Lady Beatrice's jaw tightened. You were the practical choice. Caroline and Dorothea are my blood. Their futures are my responsibility. She stopped herself. Your father left debts, Eliza. The estate was barely solvent. What little remained had to be allocated strategically. So I was allocated away. You were protected from disappointment. From the humiliation of being presented without the resources to compete. Do you think society is kind to girls with shabby dresses and no dowries? Do you think you would have been anything but pitied? The words were delivered with surgical precision. And they might have worked, once. Might have made Eliza doubt herself, question whether visibility had been a gift or a curse. But something had changed in the garden. The Earl didn't seem to pity me, Eliza said. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Beatrice's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Eliza to see the calculation behind it. Lord Blackwood is an eccentric, she said finally. His interest is unusual. It will not last, Eliza. Men of his station do not marry girls with nothing to offer. I didn't say he would marry me. Then what do you think this is? Lady Beatrice's voice rose slightly. What do you think happens next? He has made you visible, yes. But visibility without protection, without resources, without proper guidance is not a gift, it's exposure. You are not equipped for this. You never have been. And there it was again. The lie dressed as concern. You are too delicate, too unprepared, too fundamentally insufficient. But Eliza heard it differently now. Heard the fear beneath it. Because if Eliza was not too delicate, if she was not fundamentally insufficient, then every choice Lady Beatrice had made was revealed as exactly what it was, strategic erasure in service of her own daughter's advancement. Perhaps, Eliza said carefully, I should have the opportunity to discover that for myself. Lady Beatrice stared at her. You ungrateful, she stopped herself, visibly regaining control. You have no idea what you're inviting. The scrutiny, the judgment, the inevitable disappointment when Lord Blackwood's interest fades and you're left with nothing but a reputation for presumption. That's my risk to take. It's not just your risk. Every action you take reflects on this family, on Caroline and Dorothea's prospects, on your management of the situation, Eliza finished quietly. That's what you're afraid of, isn't it? Not that I'll fail, but that people will ask why I was hidden in the first place. Lady Beatrice's face went white. Get out, she said softly. Go to your room. We will discuss this when you've remembered your place. Eliza stood. But as she moved toward the door, she felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not quite defiance, but the beginning of it. My place, she said, pausing at the threshold, was never nothing. You simply convinced me it was. She left before Lady Beatrice could respond. Control, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim. Because the person who has been freed from the cage remembers what the air tastes like beyond it. And no amount of warning about danger will make them forget. That night, Eliza lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling. Everything felt different. The walls that had seemed protective now felt confining. The silence that had been familiar now felt oppressive. Even her own thoughts, usually so carefully managed, were running wild. What if Lady Beatrice was right? What if the Earl's interest was temporary, an aberration, a moment of eccentric curiosity that would fade as quickly as it had appeared? What if she had mistaken one conversation, one afternoon, for something more substantial than it was? What if she was simply exchanging one form of humiliation for another? The doubts circled, relentless. But beneath them, something else stirred. A small, stubborn voice that whispered, what if she's wrong? What if being seen, even temporarily, was better than never being seen at all? What if the risk of disappointment was preferable to the certainty of erasure? What if she deserved the chance to discover who she might be beyond the walls of this house? The next morning, a note arrived. It was delivered by a footman in the Earl's livery, addressed to Miss Eliza Harcourt, and sealed with wax bearing his crest. Lady Beatrice intercepted it in the hall. For a long moment, she simply stared at the envelope. Then, with visible reluctance, she handed it to Eliza. You will show me what it says, she said. Eliza broke the seal and read. Miss Harcourt, I am hosting a small gathering at my estate next week. Nothing formal. A few friends, conversation, perhaps some music. I would be honored if you would attend. Your presence, not your performance, is what I'm inviting. If your schedule permits, of course. Blackwood. The last line was underscored once, a subtle mockery of Lady Beatrice's earlier excuse about Eliza's occupied schedule. Eliza looked up to find her stepmother watching her with an expression that contained too many emotions to parse. "Well," Lady Beatrice said. "What does it say?" Eliza folded the note carefully. "He's invited me to a gathering at his estate." "Out of the question." "Why?" Because you're not." Lady Beatrice struggled visibly. "Because I forbid it." The words hung in the air between them, and Eliza realized, with sudden clarity, that she had a choice. She had always had a choice. She had simply been convinced she didn't. "I'm going," she said quietly. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened. "You will not. I am still responsible for you, Eliza. For your reputation. For your future. And I will not allow you to ruin yourself chasing after." "After what?" "The possibility that someone might value me. The chance that I might matter to anyone beyond this household." "You matter here." "Do I?" Eliza met her stepmother's gaze directly. "Or do I simply serve a function? The helpful pair of hands. The girl who asks for nothing because she's been taught she deserves nothing." "How dare you?" "I'm going," Eliza repeated. Her voice was steadier now. "You can forbid it. You can threaten consequences. But I'm going." Lady Beatrice stared at her as though seeing a stranger. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said finally. "No," Eliza agreed. "I don't. But I'm tired of being protected from my own life." She turned and walked away, the note clutched in her hand. And behind her, Lady Beatrice stood in silence, watching the one thing she had controlled completely begin to slip beyond her reach. The first act of reclaiming oneself is always the hardest. Because it requires rejecting the story you've been told about who you are. It requires believing that the person you might become is worth the risk of disappointing the person you've been told to be. And it requires accepting that some people will never forgive you for refusing to remain small. The final step toward freedom is not being chosen. It is choosing. The Earl's estate was smaller than Eliza had imagined, or perhaps not smaller, but less ostentatious. No towering columns or excessive ornamentation. Just clean lines, large windows, and grounds that suggested careful attention rather than deliberate display. She arrived alone. Lady Beatrice had refused to accompany her, a final act of disapproval that was meant to shame but instead felt liberating. Caroline and Dorothea had watched her depart with expressions somewhere between confusion and envy. And Eliza had stepped into the hired carriage feeling, for the first time in her life, like someone who was going toward something rather than away from it. The butler who answered the door showed no surprise at her modest dress or her arrival without chaperone. He simply bowed and led her through halls that were elegant but unpretentious, to a drawing room where voices drifted through half-open doors. "Miss Eliza Harcourt," the butler announced. The conversation paused. Eliza stepped into the room and found perhaps a dozen people gathered, some seated, some standing, all of them turning to look at her with polite curiosity. The Earl stood near the fireplace, and when he saw her, something in his expression eased. "Miss Harcourt," he said, crossing to meet her. "I'm glad you could come. Thank you for inviting me. Let me introduce you." He gestured to the room. Most of these people are incapable of useful conversation, but they're tolerable in small doses. Someone laughed. A woman near the window, dark-haired, perhaps 30, rose and approached with an amused smile. "Don't listen to him. I'm Lady Catherine Westmere, and I'm perfectly capable of useful conversation. You must be the mysterious Miss Harcourt we've been hearing about." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not certain mysterious is accurate." "Nathaniel doesn't invite people he finds uninteresting," Lady Catherine said. "Which makes you quite mysterious indeed." The afternoon unfolded with unexpected ease. The gathering was nothing like the rigid social events Eliza had observed from the margins. People spoke with actual engagement rather than performing conversation. They debated ideas, literature, politics, even science, with an intensity that suggested they cared about being right more than being agreeable. Eliza listened at first, uncertain of her place. But gradually, she found herself drawn in. When someone mentioned a recently published novel, she offered an observation. When the discussion turned to the ethics of property law, she ventured an opinion. And no one dismissed her. No one suggested her contributions were inappropriate or presumptuous. They simply engaged, as though her thoughts had value, as though she belonged in the conversation. Later, the Earl found her alone on the terrace, looking out over the gardens. "Escaping?" he asked. "Breathing," she said. "I'm not accustomed to this much conversation." "You were excellent at it." "I was terrified." "Yes," he said. "But you did it anyway. That's rather the definition of courage, isn't it?" Eliza turned to look at him. In the fading afternoon light, his face seemed less formal, less the careful arrangement of the ballroom and more simply real. "Why did you invite me?" she asked. "I told you. I find you interesting." "But why? I'm not accomplished. I'm not connected. I have no dowry, no prospects, nothing that would make me valuable by any measure your world recognizes." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "You're right," he said finally. "By those measures, you have nothing. Which is precisely why you're interesting." She frowned. "I don't understand." "Everyone I meet is performing," he said. "They're presenting the version of themselves they believe I want to see. The accomplished young lady. The charming conversationalist. The appropriate match. But you," he paused. "You don't know how to perform. Not because you lack intelligence, but because you've been taught that performance wouldn't matter anyway. So instead, you're simply honest. And honesty is the rarest thing in the world I inhabit." "Honesty born of having nothing to lose," Eliza said quietly. "Perhaps. But that doesn't make it less valuable." She looked away, across the gardens. "Your interest will fade. Once the novelty wears off. Once you realize that honesty without accomplishment is just insufficiency." "Is that what you believe?" "It's what I've been taught." "And do you still believe it?" The question hung between them. Eliza thought about the afternoon, about contributing to conversations, about being listened to, about the way Lady Catherine had asked her opinion as though it mattered. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm trying not to." He nodded, as though this answer satisfied him more than false confidence would have. "Miss Harcourt," he said carefully, "I want to be clear about something. I am not offering to rescue you. I am not your salvation or your escape. I don't want gratitude or obligation or the kind of devotion that comes from feeling indebted." She looked at him sharply. "What I'm offering," he continued, "is recognition. The acknowledgement that you exist. That your thoughts have value. That you deserve to occupy space in the world without apologizing for it." He paused. "But what you do with that recognition is entirely your choice. I will not make decisions for you. I will not tell you who you should be. I can only confirm what's already there." Eliza felt something crack open in her chest, not painful, but profound. "Why?" she whispered. "Because someone should have done this years ago," he said simply. "And no one did." That evening, as her carriage made its way back through London streets, Eliza sat with those words echoing in her mind. "I am not your salvation." He was right, of course. She had spent so long waiting to be rescued, first by her father's return, then by some miraculous change in circumstance, then by someone, anyone, noticing her absence and making it matter. But rescue implied passivity. It implied waiting for someone else to determine her worth. And that, she realized, was just another form of erasure. What she needed was not to be saved. What she needed was to save herself. The next morning, Eliza woke early and went to Lady Beatrice's study. Her stepmother looked up from correspondence with visible surprise. "Eliza, I thought you'd be." "I'm leaving," Eliza said. The words fell into the room like stones. Lady Beatrice set down her pen with careful precision. "Leaving?" "Yes. I've written to my aunt in Bath." She's elderly and needs a companion. I'll be useful there. And I'll be away from here. Your aunt has no money. Neither do I. At least there, I won't be pretending otherwise. Lady Beatrice's jaw tightened. This is about Lord Blackwood. You think he'll... This has nothing to do with Lord Blackwood, Eliza interrupted. This is about me. About refusing to spend the rest of my life in rooms where I'm tolerated but not wanted. Where I'm useful but not valued. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest. Eliza met her stepmother's gaze steadily. You taught me to be invisible. You taught me that taking up space was dangerous, that wanting anything was presumptuous, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging I was offered. And for years, I believed you. Lady Beatrice said nothing. But I don't anymore, Eliza continued. Not because someone rescued me, but because I finally understand that the story you told me about who I was, that story was never true. It was simply convenient. She turned toward the door, then paused. I don't hate you, she said quietly. I don't even blame you, really. You made choices you believed were necessary. But I'm making a different choice now. I'm choosing to exist. Fully. Without apology. Eliza. But Eliza was already leaving. Walking out of the room, out of the house, into a future that was uncertain and probably difficult and entirely, completely her own. The moment you stop waiting to be chosen is the moment you become free. Not because the world suddenly values you, but because you've stopped requiring the world's permission to value yourself. And that recognition, that self-chosen visibility, cannot be taken away. Because it was never anyone else's to give. Some stories end with marriage. This one ends with something more difficult. A woman who learned she did not need permission to exist. 18 months later, Bath. Eliza stood in her aunt's sitting room, sorting through correspondence with the efficient ease of someone who had found her rhythm in useful work. The morning light slanted through tall windows, warming the space in a way that the house on Grosvenor Square never had. Her aunt, her father's elder sister, sharp-minded despite her years, sat by the fire with a book, occasionally reading passages aloud that she found either profound or ridiculous, depending on her mood. It was a small life, quiet, and Eliza had discovered, to her surprise, that she did not mind smallness when it was chosen rather than imposed. Letter from London, her aunt said without looking up. The Blackwood crest. That's the 3rd this month. Eliza felt the familiar flutter in her chest and ignored it with practiced discipline. His persistent, she said. His courting you, child. Has been for over a year. At what point do you acknowledge that? Eliza set down the papers she'd been sorting. His corresponding with me. Tomato, tomato. Her aunt turned a page. The man writes you twice weekly, visits Bath quarterly, and last month sent you a first edition of that Gothic novel you mentioned once in passing. If that's not courtship, I'm the Queen of Prussia. He respects my choice to be here. Of course he does. He's not an idiot. Her aunt finally looked up, her gaze sharp. But respecting your choice doesn't mean he's stopped hoping you'll eventually choose him. Eliza moved to the window, looking out at the street below. Bath was not London. The social rituals were gentler here, less performative. She had found work, real work, helping her aunt manage her small estate and corresponding with various charitable organizations that needed competent administration. It was not glamorous. But it was hers. I'm not certain I'm ready, she said quietly. For what? Marriage? Love? Happiness? Her aunt's voice was dry. Or are you not certain you deserve them? The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Eliza had thought, when she left London, that she had freed herself from the internalized smallness Lady Beatrice had cultivated. But she was learning that freedom was not a single act. It was a practice. A daily choice to believe that she was allowed to want things, to occupy space, to accept affection without viewing it as charity. He's an Earl, she said. I'm a companion to an elderly woman in Bath. The mathematics don't work. The mathematics, her aunt said with emphasis, are a fiction created by people who want to control who matters and who doesn't. You know this, Eliza. You lived it. So why are you still letting other people's mathematics determine your worth? The letter sat on the hall table where the post had left it. Eliza retrieved it that evening, after her aunt had retired, and opened it in the privacy of her small bedroom. Miss Harcourt. Lady Catherine is hosting a gathering next month and has asked me to extend an invitation. She claims you were the only person at my last event who had intelligent opinions about metaphysical poetry, and she's determined to continue that conversation. I'm inclined to agree with her, though my motives are perhaps less literary than hers. The offer stands, as it always has, your presence, not your performance. No expectations. No obligations. Simply the possibility of conversation with someone I continue to find remarkable. I understand if Bath suits you better than London. I understand if my continued correspondence feels like pressure rather than possibility. But I'm a patient man, Miss Harcourt. And some things are worth waiting for. Though I confess I hope I won't have to wait forever. N. Eliza read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. There were 17 letters now. 17 missives that asked nothing and offered everything. 17 pieces of evidence that someone saw her, truly saw her, and had not looked away. She wrote her response the next morning. Lord Blackwood. Please tell Lady Catherine I would be delighted to discuss metaphysical poetry, though I suspect her real motive is matchmaking rather than literary criticism. I will attend. Not because I feel obligated, but because I'm curious to see whether the world you introduced me to still feels as real as it did 18 months ago. Whether I still feel as real as I did then. I have been practicing something in Bath, the art of taking up space without apology. Of believing that my thoughts have value. Of accepting that wanting things is not the same as being presumptuous. It is harder than it sounds. But I'm learning. I'm also learning that patience is indeed a virtue, though I suspect your patience has limits. So I should tell you, in the interest of honesty, I am not ready for grand gestures or declarations. But I might be ready for possibility. If you're still offering it. E. She sealed the letter before she could reconsider. Some women are hidden because society deems them insufficient. Some hide themselves because they've been taught that visibility is dangerous. And some, the fortunate ones, eventually learn that visibility is not something granted by others but claimed by oneself. This is a story about the latter. When Eliza arrived in London a month later, the Earl met her carriage personally. He looked the same, dark-haired, composed, with that particular quality of attention that had first caught her notice. But something in his expression when he saw her suggested relief, as though he had not been entirely certain she would come. Miss Harcourt, he said, offering his hand to help her descend. Welcome back. Lord Blackwood. She accepted his hand, felt the warmth of it through her glove. I should warn you, I've become rather opinionated during my time in Bath. Your friends may find me less agreeable than they remember. He smiled. I'm counting on it. The gathering was everything she remembered, intelligent conversation, genuine engagement, people who cared more about ideas than appearances. Lady Catherine embraced her like an old friend and immediately pulled her into a debate about the merits of Wordsworth versus Coleridge. And throughout the evening, Eliza felt something settle in her chest. This was real. She was real here. Not because she had been chosen, but because she had chosen to be present, to be visible, to believe that she belonged in rooms where minds engaged rather than performed. Later, when most of the guests had departed, the Earl found her in the library. You're still here, he observed. Your library is remarkable. I may never leave. I could arrange that. The words hung between them, not quite a proposal, but close enough that Eliza felt her pulse quicken. Nathaniel, she said carefully, I need you to understand something. If this, she gestured between them, continues, it won't be because I need rescue. Or because I'm grateful for your attention. Or because I believe you're my only option. I know. It will be because I choose it. Actively. With full awareness that I could choose otherwise. I wouldn't want it any other way. She studied his face, searching for any sign that he didn't truly understand what she was saying. But his expression was steady, patient, real. I spent years believing I was small, she said quietly. Believing that wanting anything was dangerous. That taking up space was presumptuous. That I should be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging I was offered. And now I know I was never small. I was simply convinced I was. She took a breath. And I refuse to let anyone, including you, make me forget that again. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his eyes. Eliza, he said, I fell in love with you because you couldn't pretend. Because you were honest when honesty should have been dangerous. Because you took up space even when you'd been taught not to. He paused. I don't want you smaller. I want you exactly as you are. Which is formidable. The word landed like a gift. Formidable. Not delicate. Not unsuitable. Not too much or not enough. Formidable. I might love you, she said, the words feeling strange and true in her mouth. But I need time. To be certain it's love and not just relief at being seen. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. And for the first time in her life, Eliza believed that someone's promise to stay was not contingent on her remaining small. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony that scandalized precisely no one, because by then, society had accepted what the Earl had known from the beginning. That Eliza Harcourt, formerly hidden, formerly erased, formerly convinced of her own insufficiency, was exactly the kind of woman who belonged beside a man who valued substance over spectacle. She did not become bold. She did not transform into someone unrecognizable. She simply became solid. Certain of her place in the world not because someone had given it to her, but because she had claimed it for herself. They hid her because they believed she was small. They were wrong. She was never small. She was simply waiting. Waiting to remember that visibility was always hers to claim. That presence was always hers to choose. That she had never needed permission to exist. She had only needed to stop asking for it. Some loves are never spoken of, others are remembered. If these tales have touched your heart today, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our circle. It costs nothing to join us, but to a creator, your presence means the world. Without your support, these stories remain unheard, and no passion should ever go to waste. Turn on notifications so we may continue this journey together, and share this video with someone who needs a little romance in their life. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which part of the story stayed with you the longest? Stay tuned for another powerful tale appearing on your screen now. Let yourself be swept away once more. With love, the Lord Whistledown Romance Tales team.